But pertaining to Dr. Michael Brown, and when I talk about this issue, I'm not just talking about him. I'm talking about the whole purity culture, okay, if you will, that was just so embedded and indoctrinated, okay, at that time. And this was in the 90s, going into the early 2000s. And it wasn't just, the Brownsville revival. I mean, this was all over, okay? There's a famous writer named, I think his name is Joshua Harris. He wrote the book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, as a young man back in the day. And he was a part of this purity culture, late 90s, early 2000s. And he got very, very famous, very, very popular off that book. It did very, very well. But then later on in life, he came to renounce the book. He pulled it off the shelf. And terrible story. He actually ended up walking away from his faith in Christ and ended up divorcing his wife. And I mean, just all kinds of stuff. So obviously, I'm not saying to do that. Okay. We do have to guard in our hearts against swinging the pendulum so back the other way that we just walk off a cliff the other direction. That's not what I'm advocating for. But I really do think that people like him and so many other people at that time were victims of spiritual abuse when it came to purity culture. And the interesting thing about Dr. Brown is he was a part of a group of leaders at that time who had direct authority over students, young people. And he, along with these leaders, held these students to some of the strictest standards, the most crazy and in some cases abusive standards of, quote, purity I think I've ever heard of. And, when Jesus said, judge not lest you be judged, he went on to say, with the same measure, okay, you judge with, it's going to be measured back to you. And I just find it very interesting that all of this with Dr. Brown started to come to a head in the year 2020 after he took a public position as a judge over the Todd Bentley matter. Now, I know he wasn't one of the final panelists that was convened to put out the letter and sign their names at the bottom, but he was acting like a judge, like a leader, and sort of presiding over a matter of judgment concerning another man and his sins, okay, his abuse. So there was someone who was, I think he was on staff at one point, the Fire School of Ministry. Don't quote me on this. I believe he was Dr. Brown's personal assistant at one point. So very, very close, involved in the leadership of the Fire School Ministry and Dr. Brown's organizations and ministries. He then came to Dr. Brown in 2020 after this panel of leaders was convened by Dr. Brown for the purpose of judgment. And is that coincidence, that timing? I don't think so. I think Dr. Brown stood in a place of judgment in a very, very important matter in 2019. And then that principle really kicked in, okay? With the same measure that you've measured out, it's going to be measured back to you. But purity culture, the abuse that has come from purity culture is a real thing. And if any of that is still going on, it has to change. I think a lot of it's been corrected over the last 20 years. To be honest with you, I don't even think probably Dr. Brown believes some of the same things now or practices some of the same things now that he practiced back then, because the church has progressed. The church has moved forward with some things, right? And it's not to say we move on past holiness. I mean, I'm not a progressive. I don't believe that we progress beyond the principles of the Bible or the moral statutes of God. But God's moral commandments can become a weapon in the hands of the enemy. Absolutely. And it takes wisdom to manage those things, to govern those things. Okay. And so anyways, not going to get into all that, but I do think there's been abuse, and God is exposing some of that and holding some of these leaders that committed this abuse accountable.